bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a system of bringing order to a situation in which a person or a business no longer has enough assets to satisfy the debts they've acquired from lenders. I thought bankruptcy was a declaration of financial surrender. It is, sort of. So why do we need to bring order? What we need to bring is punishment to the deadbeat. You mean it's a moral failing and we should put the debtor in prison? I wish. If there was such a thing as debtor's prison. There used to be quite a number of debtors' prisons, and other countries still have them. In fact, if you want to read a Victorian novel, it's hard to do that without reading about some character who spends wildly and ends up in the Marshalsea, London's most famous debtors' prison. But in this country, people don't go to jail for this anymore. Why not? In this country, debt isn't criminalized by our legal code. It may be socially awkward, but it will not lead to incarceration. But the poor lenders have been hosed by this awful borrower. That may be true, but there are a number of things that a lender can do in advance to protect against this kind of loss. Like what? How can you stop someone from going crazy with the plastic? Check credit in advance, demand collateral for the loans, and buy insurance to cover against the loss. So now it's the lender's fault? Why are you blaming the victim? I'm simply suggesting a few reasons for why debt is no longer criminalized in this country. The other thing to bear in mind, though, is that a lot of financial institutions make their living by issuing debt, and they need people to borrow and to get themselves into debt. And if you put a debtor in jail, how will they ever pay their loan back? They get paid for making license plates. So if these jokers do borrow more than they can pay, what does bankruptcy do? Let me ask you something. If you found out that your bank had only funds to cover about half of its deposits, what would you do? How far away from the bank do I live? You're right next door. Sprint over to get my stuff out before the bank is tapped out. What if you live miles away and all your fellow depositors live much, much closer to the bank than you do? Well, then there's no way the bank should pay some people everything and other people nothing. No, that's not very equitable. What would be better? Everyone gets an even share. Sort of. Maybe everyone should get a pro rata share of the remaining assets. And those are the cents on the dollar you often hear about with failed debt. So who sorts this out then? The federal courts. Federal? Why do we need the feds on this? I thought you said it wasn't a big deal. The U.S. Constitution says that the Congress shall have the power to establish uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. Article 1, Section 8. Whoa. This seems to have gotten very serious. You said that you would participate in a run on your bank if you found out that it had too few assets. Now imagine a person or a business who has assets throughout the entire country. If they go bankrupt, it would be chaotic and disorganized if there wasn't a central organizing system. Total chaos. Federal courts have jurisdiction throughout the entire country, so they are a good place to coordinate a central bankruptcy system. And deliver a Fed-sized bench slap. Actually, the court usually oversees one of 3 different bankruptcy proceedings: Chapter 7, Chapter 11, or Chapter 13. Those are the most likely. Seems weird to start the story halfway through, but what's the difference? Chapter 7 is the most common form of bankruptcy. It involves liquidation. Yikes. Who's the filthy liquidator? The bankruptcy court appoints a trustee to liquidate the bankrupt's estate. Those assets are then used either pro forma or in a system of seniority to repay the debt. Seniority, remember, comes from things like senior debt, subordinated debt, and it bears in mind the concept that almost all debt has priority over equity. Using that system, the trustee will repay what it can of the outstanding debts. And the bankrupt is cleaned out! Actually, the bankrupt is almost always allowed to keep certain property exempt from the bankruptcy proceedings, usually a place to live. And if you've got some cool doodads, time to give them away to friends and relatives. Those kinds of gifts are likely to be considered fraudulent conveyances and disallowed. What are those other variations? Often a person or a business is going to be worth more in the long term if it's allowed to keep operating in the way that it's been doing business instead of just being liquidated outright. How do you mean? If you liquidated a very popular restaurant, you'd probably get a very feeble sum from selling a few knives and forks. On the other hand, if you allowed the business to continue operating for several years, the business might be able to bring in enough money over a several-year period to actually satisfy much more of the debts. Okay, I'll allow the concept. What does this have to do with bankruptcy? In Chapter 11 and Chapter 13 bankruptcies, the individual or the business isn't actually liquidated. Instead, a plan is devised by which they're allowed to reorganize their affairs, reprioritize some of the debts, and to come up with a system of repaying the loans, or as much of them as they can, over several years. The lenders will almost always have to agree to take a haircut on the amounts that they loaned, or agree to a longer period by which they get repaid. But in a Chapter 11 or 13 bankruptcy, if it's successful, they're likely to get a lot more money out of that than simply a Chapter 7 liquidation. Sounds like a good system for deadbeats. How about I just rack up some huge bills, and then when the bills come due, I file for bankruptcy? Well, first, you'll probably face years of extremely unpleasant telephone calls from collection agencies. Yo, I got caller ID. Second, you might be able to pull off a bankruptcy once without catastrophic results, but what do you think is going to happen the next time after that? I get a clean slate, right? Future lenders are likely either to refrain from giving you any loans, or to force you to take some years to rebuild your credit, or charge you more for any loans that they do give you. I thought all was forgiven. Your defaults may be forgiven through bankruptcy, but they won't be forgotten. Word.